Can you guys hear me? Hello, Golden Hawk 583. Thought I would try another live stream. Thank you, Golden Hawk 583. Can you see me yet? Okay. All right, let's get going. Let's shut this music down. Did y'all hear about this? Beyond Meat Factory riddled with mold and other dirty conditions? Dirty vegan conditions? Nasty. Reminds me of David Rams, another nasty vegan. Speaking of David, let's go to his channel. This is one of his recent posts. Non-vegans, he says, when it comes to processed foods, Gollum says, we loves processed foods. Cheeses, bacons, cereals, ice creams. Hates processed foods, we does. Filthy vegan foods like Beyond Meatses. Filthy vegan foods like Beyond Meatses. Is he trying to tell his vegan followers about the dirty conditions at the Beyond Meat Factory without actually telling them? What else is he not telling his vegan followers? He's talking about processed foods. Well, he's not telling his vegan followers the difference between processed foods and ultra processed foods. Why is that important? Well, because processed foods could just be baby carrots are processed foods. Processed foods and ultra processed foods are two different things. So when he starts accusing omnivores of eating processed foods like bacon and ice cream, but then fails to reveal to his vegan followers that Vegans eat more ultra processed foods than any other group of eaters. Here's the study that proves that to be the case. Consumption of ultra-processed foods by pesco-vegetarians, vegetarians, and vegans. Look right down here at the conclusions, or look at the results. Higher avoidance of animal-based foods was associated with a higher consumption of ultra-processed foods. With ultra-processed foods supplying 33%, 32.5%, 37%, and 39.5% of energy intakes for meat eaters. And when they say meat eaters, they're really talking about omnivores, the standard diet. They label them as meat eaters because they're trying to be dishonest. They're trying to, the people that put these studies together want to mischaracterize omnivores as meat eaters because that's the only way to smear a diet that is predominantly meat-based, even if there's a small amount of plants versus the standard omnivore diet is about 70% plants and 30% meat. So it's really not fair to call them meat eaters. Most meat eaters, as we think of them, keto or carnivore followers, they eat very little, perhaps zero ultra-processed foods. Now, I did put this in graph form so that we could see what that looks like. So vegans consume more ultra-processed foods than any other group of eaters. Omnivores at 33% of their energy intake, pesco-vegetarians at 32.5% of their energy intake, vegetarians, 37% of their energy intake is ultra-processed foods, and topping it out right there is the vegans at 39.5% of their energy intake is ultra-processed foods. So why is that important to know? Because if you look it up, you'll see that ultra-processed foods are associated with all of the diseases that vegans like to accuse meat eaters of suffering from. Obesity, heart disease, high blood pressure, type 2 diabetes, and colon cancer, and others. You can look this up yourself. Ultra-processed foods eaten by vegans, predominantly more than any other group of eaters, vegans are consuming ultra-processed foods. And this is one of the main reasons why they remain at 2% of the population on an ongoing basis, even though most of them give up on veganism within the first year. So it's kind of like a pyramid scheme where the bulk of the participants are being burned out every year only to be replaced by new victims. New victims constantly coming in and old victims constantly falling off. So you'll notice that David Rams, going back to his post here, he's talking about processed foods. He will not do his vegan followers the favor of warning them about the dangers of ultra processed foods. And he's playing the tu quo que fallacy here by pointing at omnivores and telling his vegan followers that, hey, the omnivores also eat processed foods like cheeses and bacons and cereals and ice creams. Meanwhile, he certainly isn't telling his followers about the old he's not telling them this fact, that vegans are consuming more ultra processed foods than any other group of eaters. And he's also not telling them that their fake burgers and fake meat factories are being shut down because they're filthy. How many we have? We have 12 viewers right now. Anyone have any other subjects they want to cover today? Hello, Deandra Gomez, Highland Fleet Loot, Green Ghost, Dragonfire, Let's Go Carney, Elliot Davies. Welcome. That's really all I had prepared. Was I wanted to expose David Rams and his failure to warn his vegan followers of the fact that it's not processed foods they should be concerned about, but the ultra processed foods that the vegans are consuming. At higher rates than any other group of eaters. Do you think David Rams will ever tell his vegan followers about this? Probably not. I wonder if he gets a kickback from the ultra-processed vegan food industry. I bet he does. What do you think? Serious person asks, does veganism give you longer life? There's no evidence that it does, is there? There's absolutely no evidence that veganism gives anyone longer life. Golden Hawk 583 asks, I wonder what the percentage would be among carnivores that cheats just a little bit. Cheats, by carnivores, you mean zero plant foods? Oh, I would say it's probably pretty high. TH Primal, hello. There are a lot of people who claim to be carnivores or keto carnivores that are cheating. That group of dieters can also become quite dogmatic. Kiko Lanzik says, I think vegetarian, not vegan. Regarding what, I'm not sure. I think eating seasonally is okay, says Dragonfire. And I think what you mean there is naturally human beings would have seasonal limitations on certain plant foods. Berries and fruits there's a window of time every year that they would naturally be available. And even wolves will eat berries when they are ripe and in reach. Carbohydrates are not in and of themselves bad for you. When they become harmful is when you're consuming carbohydrates and your glycogen stores are already full. The average human being has the capacity to store about 500 grams of carbohydrates as glycogen in the muscles and in the liver. The muscles in the average human being can store about 300 grams of glycogen, and the liver can store about 200 grams of glycogen. The problem is that we've been tricked into eating too frequently. Breakfast, for instance, is a complete 100% complete invented meal. The food industry, specifically the cereal industry, invented breakfast. And that was followed up by Edward Bernays promoting it. Kiko Lanzik says, why? Milk products plus Beyond Meat vegans are more frutivores, I guess. Actually, vegans don't eat as much fruit, I don't think, as they do ultra processed foods. Most vegans are constantly preoccupied with the thought of the desire for eating meat. And they will try new recipes, they will try new products, but a lot of vegans are eating these ultra processed, industrial seed oil impregnated, toxic, fake meat products. But as I was saying about the glycogen stores, is that if you are eating carbohydrates and you're halting your carbohydrate consumption before or at the point that your glycogen stores become full, then there is no harm done. And it's like breathing. You breathe in and you breathe out. And the problem with glycogen, people who consume carbohydrates get into the habit of breathing in and then breathing in again before they breathe out. And that's one reason why intermittent fasting is such a valuable tool for people. Intermittent fasting really only replicates the natural eating pattern of a human being, which would be eating once at the end of the day. You would eat carbohydrates in that meal many times depending on the season. Your glycogen stores would be recharged, similar to the way that you charge your cell phone at night. And then you would wake up and go spend that glycogen in pursuit of the next day's meals. So it's all about glycogen management. You can fill your glycogen stores in the evening and then spend your glycogen stores the next day, and then fill them again the next evening, and then spend them the next day. So it's an inhale, exhale pattern. But the problem is that the food industry has tricked you, or a lot of people, most people, into, when it comes to food, inhale, inhale, inhale. They've turned your activity levels down. They've presented you with all kinds of entertainment to keep you sedentary and comfortable and habitualized to a sedentary lifestyle, and then tell you to think within the realm of, what can I eat to lose weight? Most people are overweight and they try to think, what can I eat to lose weight? When that's like saying, what kind of gas can I put in my car to empty the tank? It's, if you want to empty the gas out of your tank in your car, you don't do that by going and putting some type of special fuel in the tank. You do it by driving the vehicle. You drive it. And ideally, you're not going to refill your glycogen stores as a human being until your glycogen stores are on the low end. But if you consume carbohydrates and your glycogen stores are already topped off, that's when things like the Randle cycle begin to harm you. But if you're within your glycogen store capacity and you're consuming carbohydrate, glycogen stores are not going to harm you. Or consuming carbohydrates is not going to harm you. It's when you go over your storage capacity, when you have topped out your glycogen store potential, that's when you start to cause damage and you start to add fat to your body fat, adipose. In fact, there are many nutrients that are shuffled into the cells much better when there's insulin involved. If you have low insulin at all times, then there is a possibility that you could stumble into certain deficiencies simply because, not because you're not consuming those nutrients, those micronutrients, but because those micronutrients aren't being shuffled into your cells by an insulin surge. The problem with insulin is that people abuse it. They wake up in the morning and they consume orange juice and cereal. Well, you get a huge insulin surge first thing in the morning. And then you do it for a snack before lunch. And then at lunch, you have another high carbohydrate meal. And then you have another snack and another insulin surge. And so you do that multiple times per day. So at the end of the day, right before you go to bed, if you were to do a tally, well, you've had maybe 10, 12, 14 insulin surges in that one day. And that's day after day after day. But if you limit your insulin surge to one per day, that's a completely different scenario, especially if you're keeping your carbohydrate consumption low enough so that your glycogen stores are not being surpassed. Your glycogen store potential is not being surpassed. I think that low carb omnivore is probably the healthiest way to be. If you find that you're if you find that you're gaining body fat, then that means that you're surpassing your glycogen store potential. If you have surpassed your glycogen store potential day after day after day, and you begin to notice that your body fat is going up, then there's two ways that you can lower that back down, and that's either by eating a ketogenic diet or by fasting. And fasting, I believe, is better because it also offers the added benefit of autophagy. Is everyone here familiar with autophagy? Autophagy is what happens when your body runs out of fuel, runs out of glycogen, runs out of incoming calories, and so it will go in and begin to disassemble broken organelles and other cellular structures that are malfunctioning and recycle them. In fact, I believe it's a 72-hour fast has been proven to reset and ramp up one's immune system. So it's kind of counterintuitive because a lot of people think that eating, and the more frequently you eat, the higher your immune system will be, but actually your immune system will be suppressed when you have elevated blood sugar, which really isn't that big a deal if you're doing it, say, once a day or once every 2 days. But if you're keeping your blood sugar elevated during all waking hours and into some sleeping hours as well, then that's going to depress your immune system. Yeah, I don't know if you guys have seen the video footage of wolves eating berries in the wild. There are, you won't see, I don't think that you will find any wild cats that do that. Cats they're leaning much harder into the carnivore biology than human beings or wolves. Human beings and wolves are almost exactly the same when it comes to our digestive tracts. And our diet is naturally meat heavy with supplemental carbohydrates. If you look into the history of human cooking, the cooking was done for a lot of plants. Human beings did discover that by cooking certain tubers, for instance, like the ancestors of the modern potato, became non-poisonous when we would cook it. And so those would be a seasonal source of glycogen supplementation. When human beings would make a kill, like a large bison, the liver would almost always be eaten almost immediately or almost immediately, and it would be cut into servings that would be shared amongst members of the tribe. And some of the muscle meat was eaten raw, but a lot of the muscle meat was also smoked and dried. But I don't know if you've ever tried to eat some of the tougher cuts of meat and the meats around the joints and some of the tissues around the joint that would provide nutritional sustenance would have been boiled, and that allows easier access. So this history has already been cataloged. I don't really know where some of the carnivore people get their information. Um, there are some that claim that human beings would naturally only eat raw meat, while human beings would naturally eat raw meat. That is not the only way that human beings historically, during a hunter-gatherer times when we have been proven to be our most healthy, we would eat a combination of cooked and raw meat. One of the ways that we preserved meat was either smoking it, drying it, or making pemmican, which is like a high-fat meat bar. Dr. G's treadmill technician says that's why veganism would be impossible 100 years ago in most Western countries without having all their fruit and veggies all year round. Yeah, there, there's one food that's available all year, and that's meat. All berries are seasonal. Berries, nuts, roots, tubers, fruits were all seasonal. There's always a window of time. We have wild plums here in central Texas that grow, and I've got some of those trees here on my property, and there's a short window of time that you can get out there and harvest some of those wild plums. We like to make jam out of it, but you've got to get there before the birds get to it and before the other small mammals will get to it, because they don't wild animals don't just wait on you to come get your share before they go in and take theirs. Tanu, Tanuzo Nickelfritz asks, have you tried pemmican? Sounds interesting. I actually haven't. I have not tried pemmican. I believe there's two different recipes that are predominant. One is just the fat and the meat, and the other one is fat, meat, and fruit, like dried fruit mixed in. I believe the fruit version doesn't have quite the shelf life that the fat and meat version has. You can order. There are companies that sell pemmican bars. Um, I haven't made pemmican before, but I have been canning some meat. Golden Hawk 583 says, I have asked many vegans how something they feel going out in nature. What plants there makes their mouth water? They tend not to reply. Yeah, if a vegan was going to try to live off the land, they would certainly starve to death in very short order. But yes, human beings are designed to eat mostly meat. And when I say meat, we're talking about nose to tail. There's never been, just like there's never been until modern times, there was never a population of human beings that ate only muscle meat. I have videos that compare the micronutrients of the organs compared to just the muscle meat. And while the muscle meat is head and shoulders above any plant foods, the organs are head and shoulders above the muscle meat. And I've also done research into the constant vitamin A scaring, uh, not just vegans, but also people in the carnivore community will try to scare you about the vitamin A in liver being too high. But the fact of the matter is that all studies that have shown any type of hyper vitamin toxicity regarding vitamin A have been synthetic vitamin A, and uh, the polar bear liver story is a basically a hypothesis. The Arctic explorers that died, that they're saying died because of toxic vitamin A from polar bear liver, these people died like in 1913, and that hypothesis was formulated in the 1960s. So these so-called scientists that supposedly proved that people eating polar bear liver died from too much vitamin A, that's a hypothesis. And they didn't even eat polar bear liver. They had to eat these guys that died actually ended up having to eat their dogs, because the guy that was with them who was carrying all the food on his sled, he ended up falling into a crevasse, and they lost him, his dogs, and all of the food. So these two guys who were kind of a vegetarian philosophy, they end up having to kill and eat their own dogs. And the story was that they had fed the dogs some polar bear liver, and therefore when they ate the dog liver, they got a secondhand overdose of vitamin A. But again, these guys died in 1913, something like that, and that hypothesis was never formulated until the 1960s. So it's not like they were actually able to, uh, look at the remains of these men or do any type of hands-on study of their tissues. It was all just a couple of so-called scientists that threw that hypothesis out there. And meanwhile, I do believe that there is a vitamin A toxicity in regard to synthetic vitamins. In fact, I don't think any of the synthetic vitamins are bioidentical to the natural counterpart that you would find in animal tissues. Charger Mopar says, I always challenge these nuts who call anything not from mammal milk. Yeah, it's ridiculous that they use words like milk and cream and meat and chicken. If veganism was any kind of natural diet for human being, then vegans wouldn't be constantly borrowing verbiage from the carnivore community. You don't see that the other way around. You don't see carnivores making fake broccoli out of hamburger meat. Almonds are very high in cyanide. Almonds are part of the seed of the almond plant. So we know that from the science of botany that all plants will protect their seeds with anti-nutrients and poisons. This is why you can't eat, if you were to eat raw flour, it would make you sick. because the toxins that the plant naturally places in the seeds will harm you, and the cooking will knock some of that down, make it at least somewhat edible. That's also why they have sourdough bread. Sourdough bread was not invented so that we would have another flavor of bread. It was invented because they discovered that fermenting the dough would knock the toxins and anti-nutrients down another level. I give my ducks meat scraps, says Charger Mopar, and I do the same thing with my chickens. They love meat. I have videos on that as well. Rabbit meat with eggs added will keep you, your dog, and your cat alive and healthy for those that don't have a farm. Yeah, so I guess there's a lot of, I know that when I was a boy, it was not uncommon for people to keep rabbits and chickens in their backyard for meat and eggs. Just reading through the comments here, seeing if there's anything of interest that I missed. Yeah, I think that if you were going to say, I'm going to eat a diet of meat and potatoes, if you were to keep the balance at about 90 to 95% meat and 10 to 5% potatoes, and you ate a large meat and potato meal at the end of each day, then that would probably restack your glycogen stores within the potential, preventing you from suffering the harmful effects of the Randall cycle, but also give you fuel for the next day that you can burn. The fact about athletes is regarding carbohydrates is that a fat adapted individual will burn a lot of fat during exercise. However, the intensity, in order to perform at a respectable level, the intensity of that exercise must be kept very low, because it takes a whole lot more oxygen to metabolize fat than it does to metabolize sugar. And that's it's one of the reasons why Sean Baker, for instance, that's a 500-meter row is a pretty high intensity, but it's pretty short. It's relatively short. So you're going to be finishing that within, under a 2-minute exercise bout, which would be a long enough duration to burn up glycogen stores without having to fall back on fat. Because if you fall back on fat, then you require more oxygen, and that will harm your performance. So there will never be a long-term professional rugby player who's 100% keto. Those guys are consuming a lot of carbohydrates because glycogen for high intensity exercise is ideal. The problem again is when an athlete is consuming more carbohydrates than they can store as glycogen. At that point, the Randle cycle begins to harm them and they start to deposit excess body fat. And excess body fat is excess weight, and excess weight translates to slower movement. Let's Go Carney asks, isn't rice preferred over potatoes for carbs? It uh, Potentially it can. Of course, white rice would be better than brown rice because brown rice is going to have a higher level of toxins and anti-nutrients in it because of the fiber. But I think that potatoes can actually be cleaned pretty well, but they must be boiled or pressure cooked in ideally distilled water, because if you use tap water or well water, hard water for instance, that's got a lot of calcium or minerals dissolved into it, then those waters will have a lower potential of pulling out toxins from things like potatoes, whereas distilled water is pure water, and so its potential to pull out and absorb toxins from any plant foods that you'd want to cook, distilled water does a much better job. And whenever I cook potatoes, I will either boil them or pressure cook them in distilled water. And ideally, you would cook it one round, drain that water, add fresh distilled water, and cook it a second time. And I think with that technique, you can lower the toxins in potatoes down to something comparable to white rice. Although, look into this and you'll see that white rice also has higher levels of mercury than some of the other starch sources. So everything has to be, every plant food out there today must be examined, and each one has to be, you have to consider the toxins or the heavy metals that might be found in each one of them, and then take whatever precautions, do whatever you need to do to pull those out or knock them down. Mimes of Uckery says, I can't reverse live stream and I'm suffering from lag. You need to change the settings on this stream. Okay, well, I'm not sure how to do that, but I will. I'll master that before I do the next stream. My apologies. Anyone else suffering lag on this live stream? Plantains are a source of carbohydrates that can be used like potatoes. Yes, plantains, those are like a small, starchy, similar to banana, I believe. And I assume that plantains, I'm not sure what types of pesticides might have creeped into the flesh of a plantain. I have not looked into that, but it's something also to consider. Let's Go Carney asks, what's your opinion on eating organs that used to contain acids? Well, if the acids have been removed, then I don't know what the problem would be. Keiko Lanzik says no lags, change quality maybe. Yeah, perhaps. Charger Mopar, what part of the world, what general region of the world are you living in where plantains are growing wild? And also, what is the window of time that they're available? Are they available year round? South Florida, they are common planting and grow year round. Interesting. Well, I suppose in tropical areas, there's going to be fruits that grow year round. Um, Interestingly, um, the hunter-gatherer populations, remains of these human beings were predominantly found along the coastlines. So they would have had access to some fruits that would be growing year round. They would have access to fish and bivalves and other iodine containing life forms in the on the coast. But then when you turn around, then there would be land mammals that they would eat. So, a combination of seasonally available uh, roots, tubers, berries, fruits, mammal meat, bird meat, reptile meat, fish, bivalves, lobsters, crabs. Have have you heard about the nationalization of farms in Holland? I have not. I suppose that that's probably I know that the line that separates corporations from government are being removed around the world. So I just wonder if by nationalization, does that mean that Bayer Monsanto has taken over all the farms of Holland? I'm not sure. Is Holland one of the areas where the farmers have been protesting? Plenty of iguanas running around here. I love eating them. I've never eaten an iguana. I have eaten rattlesnake. I would bet that they taste similar. Andromeda Palazzolos asks, do you consume local bee pollen and raw honey? I do buy raw honey. I don't consume a lot of honey, but there are um, some local producers that I do buy honey from time to time. Charger Mopar says iguana taste ranges from fish to chicken. I guess that's depending on how it's cooked or maybe from what part of the body the meat comes from. They blame Dutch farmers for nitrogen pollution. Well, there's actually some truth to that. The crop farmers have been over spraying nitrogen, and the excess nitrogen will run off into local waterways and cause fish kills and algae blooms, red tides, oceanic dead zones. It happens also in the Gulf of Mexico. Happens all around Florida. And if you look into a farmer named Gabe Brown, he has taken the best of regenerative ruminant grazing systems and paired it with no-till crop farming, and he's using mob grazing to fertilize his cash crops, and has at this point removed all artificial nitrogen inputs. And in a no-till situation, then you're going to have a lot more water infiltration into the soil because of the high carbon content of the that results in the soils that receive that treatment, which is basically mimicking nature. And that way that water is able to percolate into the ground and be held by the soil, but also feed the aquifers and feed the local tributaries with spring water. Whereas the areas that have been heavily tilled, there's a layer of what's called hard pan just below the reach of the tillage arms. And this hard pan is similar to Teflon. It will not allow water to penetrate, and it causes flooding. And that flooding also causes gargantuan agrochemical runoff, which would include crop nitrogen. And that nitrogen is causing problems. However, the answer is not shutting the farmers down. That would only lead to famine. The answer is, like Gabe Brown, the farmer, marrying rotational ruminant grazing systems with no-till crop agriculture. Yeah, Golden Hawk 583 says 3,000 farmers, mostly beef farmers in Holland, are set to be discontinued. So the beef farmers actually have very little to do with any of the nutrient runoff into the streams and rivers and oceans. That's primarily crop farming that's doing that. And it really just it makes me think that the world rulers are actually aiming for implementing a hydraulic civilization or a hydraulic global empire. If you don't know what a hydraulic empire is, look that up. That actually is a video that a live stream that I'm going to be doing soon, is on the what looks to be a coming global hydraulic empire. Guggen Slayer says, I comment the runoff pollution kills on many vegan posts. Yeah, the vegan comeback to that is always the lie that most crops are grown to feed livestock, when the truth is that almost 90% of all livestock feed is industrial waste left over from the processing that goes on with corn and other grains. A lot of it is called distiller's corn or distiller's grain, and this is also known as spent grains. So these grains have already been processed, and what's left over is used to be considered just a straight up industrial waste, and they used to pile it up and burn it. And then the livestock nutrition industry discovered that, hey, we can feed this to ruminants and they can turn it into meat. So why don't we do that? So the fact of the matter is that the vegans will lie and say that most crops are grown to feed livestock when a very small percentage of crops are grown specifically to feed livestock. Most crops are grown specifically for processing to extract or produce some product that's destined solely for human consumption, and it's the waste products left over that they'll feed to livestock. Any other questions? Let's Go Carney says, I'm worried about the excess amount of lignin that finds its way into our food chain through animal feed. And yes, there are um, there's a lot of negatives to feeding crops or byproducts, industrial wastes to livestock. Um, Greg Saladin had a great idea, and that would be for all restaurants. If every restaurant in the world had a chicken coop out back where they would take the leftover foods that people left on their plate and feed them to the chickens, then they would have a never ending source of chicken meat and eggs. But right now, they dump that food into the landfills. So it just becomes a source of methane with really no valuable return, all that wasted food. But regarding all of the ruminant animals, what they should do there is get rid of nearly all of the um, feed stuff feeding the distillers' grains and the other industrial waste. Stop feeding them that and just go just as close to 100% as possible into the regenerative ruminant grazing systems like you see with Gabe Brown and Joel Salatin and Greg Judy and Garland Farms. It rebuilds soil health, it rebuilds soil carbon, it makes the soil able to absorb and hold water again, it increases foliage density. Joel Salatin, for instance, has surpassed 400 cow days per acre, meaning that he's done the regenerative ruminant grazing enough times now that he's increased the carbon content of his soil to the point where the vegetation is growing so densely that each acre can support one cow for more than 400 days. And that's a type of animal agriculture that vegans absolutely hate, because you can raise a cow or a steer in that type of operation and spray absolutely no chemicals, no pesticides, no nitrogen, no phosphorus, no potassium, and enact zero crop protection measures, produce an animal that will feed a human being between 1 and 3 years, and basically, if vegans were to pursue honestly their stated goal of causing the least amount of harm, then they would be eating a diet that's based on large ruminant animals that have been raised regeneratively. I'm reading these comments again about the Holland farmers being shut down. This is this is something that's a global problem. You know, they really have, they're really trying to cut down on the food supply, I guess. They're targeting both animal and crop farmers, which makes absolutely no sense unless you were trying to engineer a famine. And if you look into famines, famines are never a result of just accidental lack of food. They're always political. There's always a political basis for every famine that's happening in modern times. So we have to be very careful about the Davos crowd and their climate, their new climate war that they're waging against farmers, because it could easily result in a global famine. And if they don't succeed in outright starving people to death, if they continue to unjustifiably demonize animal agriculture, and they're basically blaming all of the problems that's primarily coming from crop agriculture because of all of the pesticides and agrochemicals that are required, all of the synthetic nitrogen, mined potassium, and mined phosphorus that is destroying the world's ecosystem. Um, the animal agriculture has very very little to do with it, and the operations that are contributing to those operations, or to those problems, those operations should just simply transition into the regenerative model. Everyone should look up. I think the best one out there, the best two that I think are three, would be Gabe Brown, Greg Judy, and Joel Salatin. Let's Go Carney says many believe that the land taken from farmers will be given back to nature. Nothing is less true. They will just pour more concrete on that land. And I think that's certainly possible. One thing's for certain is that if that land is given back to nature, and it's not given back to nature in a way that food can be harvested from it, then again, I don't think they could deny that that's just a road to global famine. Golden Hawk 583 says, well, apparently we are to become insectivores now. Yeah, I think insects have probably always been a small portion of the human diet. Um, of course, I don't think that the exoskeleton would be uh, the sought after portion of any insect, but perhaps the soft bodied larval stages would probably have been harvested and consumed, or perhaps something like a grasshopper. You can remove much of the exoskeleton from that. It's like a crab is basically an ocean insect. Lobster is basically an ocean insect. So there is nutritional sustenance there. However, there's also some, as far as I believe it's chitin, the type of protein that makes up the exoskeleton. is similar to fingernails. It's not a digestible protein by and large. And if they were to, maybe if they were to grind it into a powder, but then it also it can get lodged in your lungs and cause cancer. So uh, I'm not sure what other nutrients might be missing. Like for instance, heme iron. I don't know that there's any insect that's got a lot of heme iron in it. I'm not sure if they have methylcobalamin, the human bioactive B12. Uh, there's not a lot of literature on the nutritional um, breakdown of a whole lot of different insects. Golden Hawk 583 says chitin, yes, but also the fact that up to 80% of the farmed bugs contain parasites, 30% which are dangerous to humans. It wouldn't surprise me at all. That's the first I've heard of that, but there's a lot of the science behind being an insectivore that I'm not privy to yet. Um, you know, when Bayer Pharmaceuticals bought Monsanto, then there was basically a marriage between the drug industry and the food industry, and that was a marriage made in hell. There's lots of news articles you can read about that. There were, congressional hearings where lots of lobbying went on to allow that to occur, because you really don't want the industry that makes a profit from you being sick under the same umbrella as the industry that's supposed to provide you the food so that you can be healthy and thrive. I mean, that's a conflict of interest that should have never been allowed. And it's just another reason why we should be unlike the vegans, and we should make a conscious effort to avoid ultra processed foods, and also try to buy fruits and vegetables and meats that are produced by your local farmers. Your local farmers need your business, and the healthier the fiscal situation is of your local farmers, then the higher your own food security situation will be. For people in United States to be reliant upon companies from Brazil to provide them beef, for instance, that's a very bad idea, because those sources can be turned off just like you turn off a light switch. It's much more difficult to do when populations are getting most of their nutritional sustenance from local farmers. Sarisara says, what about food complexity, like having big amounts of different ingredients aside from being processed? Having big amounts of different ingredients, long ingredients lists, this is a characteristic of ultra processed foods. And it's usually when you look at the ingredients list and it looks like a novel or someone's term paper or a thesis, a long paragraph full of words that can't be defined or pronounced, then usually you're looking at an ultra processed food that is full of chemicals that are unhealthy. Again, vegans eat more of these types of foods than vegetarians or omnivores. And most omnivores are not meat based. Here in the United States, for instance, the USDA has published that your average American that's eating the standard American diet that's causing all this disease is 70% plant based and 30% meat based. So most of the foods people are eating are processed, and most of that processed food comes from plants. And you won't be able, here in the United States at least, you can't go into a grocery store anymore and buy, say, a cake, for instance, that's made with butter uh, or anything that's got lard as an ingredient. Um, the the uh, the oil that they're using is going to be either canola oil or palm oil or some other toxic industrial oil, and all of the health problems that come from seed oils and other toxic industrial oils, industrial seed oils, palm oil. Uh, the harmful effects of these is still being blamed on saturated animal fat. And saturated animal fat has almost been eradicated from the human diet, and the industrial seed oils are higher than ever, and disease rates are at an all-time high and climbing. Let's Go Carney says when you need to study chemistry for 20 years just to know what's in the food, it's best to put it back in the aisle. And that's absolutely true. If we would all just stop giving these ultra processed food companies our business and eat 99% whole foods, meat based or animal based diet, nose to tail. Um, you know, it's you. We live in a world where it's an absolute crime to sell raw milk, but you can sell high fructose corn syrup to children all day long. So something's not on the up and up. Saras says rare to find decent milk on the shelves as well. It's all watered down and full of additives to make it look like milk. Yeah, I'm sure that there's probably something added. I know that it's hard to find milk on the shelf that's not been fortified with vitamin D. Who knows what else they're adding to it, and it's all been pasteurized. So, as I understand it, the pasteurization process destroys some of the nutrients, some of the enzymes that otherwise would play a large role in a healthy human biology. Zenwin AZ, I assume that means Arizona, not sure, but welcome to the live stream. I have a live stream that I'm going to do pretty soon. I'm probably going to have a guest on and show them what I discovered about. And this may seem like it's not related, but it actually is. Um, the actual purpose for the Great Pyramids in Egypt was actually a very practical function that they served. But I've been putting together a presentation so that people can. It didn't have anything to do with energy. It didn't have anything to do with aliens. It didn't have anything to do with the stars. It was a very practical purpose why those pyramids were built. And people need to know because it has implications on our future. People need to know what the true purpose of those pyramids were. I don't want to go into it today because I want to do it all in one live stream. Anyone have any other questions today? Otherwise, I guess we should wrap it up. I thank y'all for coming. I thank y'all for listening and watching today. I really appreciate it. This is the first time I've done a stream in a long time. This is a different computer than I tried it with before. The other one I had just didn't have enough RAM to do it, so we'll do more of these. Y'all make a list of questions that we can address on the next one. And I love you guys. Thank you for coming. Take care.